Okay, we are at 10:30. Wonderful to see 35 people in here already. Yeah, let's get started. Good morning, everyone. I'm Kirley Freeman. I'm the Director of Outreach and Experiential Learning for the Faculty of Arts at St. Mary's. And it's with gratitude that I acknowledge that St. Mary's is located on the unceded and ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq. I feel very grateful to be living and working here. It's also a wonderful pleasure this morning to introduce our two presenters. So Deborah Brothers-Scott is the Director, Diversity, Inclusion and Wellness at St. Mary's, and Dr. Rohini Bannerjee is our Associate Vice President, Diversity Excellence. So I will turn the floor over to them, and I know that you join me in thanking them for their time this morning. Okay, Deborah and Rohini, take it away.
So good morning, everyone. The session today, we named Fundamentals of Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Decolonization. Okay.
Debbie, we don't see your next slide.
You don't see it. Okay, I see it here. Okay. Carly, I'm sorry. I'm just wondering if I could, sorry, Carolee. I'm just wondering if I should send you my presentation.
Sure.
Then you can display it because I seem to be having some issues here on my laptop.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
My apologies, everyone. Let me get that over to you. And your SMU email address is okay?
Did everybody else's computers also decide to update this morning? Updated, like Zoom updated, like everything updated this morning. All right. Okay, let me share my screen. How's that?
Perfect.
That's fabulous. Thank you.
Excellent.
All right, I think you can go right into the next slide, Kirley, whenever you're ready.
All right.
And I did throw into the chat, I saw that Nadine had said she was saying hello from Yarmouth. So I did ask if you want to share your location in Mi'kmaq. Be nice to see where we're all joining. So good morning, bonjour. You get to see perhaps another perspective of facilitators doing some active unlearning by getting to know a little bit who we are, because that contextualization, Deborah and I feel, is important to understanding, how we present and dialogue on decolonization. So I happily and proudly say that I'm a woman of color, and my matrilineal line is indigenous to northern Himachal Pradesh in northern India. I'm cisgendered, and I absolutely love color in all its forms. I am a speaker of English and a francophone de formation. That means I'm a learned speaker, and I feel like I'm a polyglot by in my heart. I am a working middle class, a daughter of immigrants to Mi'kma'ki, and due to the occupation of Britain of parts of the South Asian subcontinent, my family chooses the Church of England as their source of faith. I am educated with a post-secondary degree and do dabble in poetry and short stories as well. I am heterosexual and a mother of 3 male children who keep my fridge empty all the time. I have been raised in a 2-parent household and have been offered private education with financial aid. I'm able-bodied, and that's part of my privilege. And my family is part of the hard of hearing community. I am born and in Mi'kma'ki, and I honor my South Asian heritage whenever I can. Deborah. That will be the next slide, Kirli.
Oh,
Oh, excuse me. Good morning, everyone. Excuse me. I too identify as a woman of color. I'm African Nova Scotian with roots in the Annapolis Valley. My mother is from the Black community of Inglewood in the Bridgetown area, and my father comes from Cambridge, which is just outside of, I would say, New Minas, in between New Minas and Waterville. I'm a cisgendered wife, mother, sister, and daughter. I'm an English speaker, and I love sports and fashion. I consider myself middle class, although sometimes I really don't know. I'm raised in Halifax, post-secondary educated, heterosexual, married mother of 4, raised in a 2-parent household. I'm able-bodied, and I'm a Canadian citizen.
Next slide. And as Kirli started, and as I and myself, Deborah, echo the gratitude to the treaty people, and that the fact that all of us are treaty people here in Mi'kma'ki, and that there are responsibilities that we have to each other and to the land that we occupy, play, work, and share. We also recognize the 400-year history of communities of African descent and the 50 African Nova Scotian communities throughout the region today. So this acknowledgement of our presence, we come with it with that knowing who we are. And that is really important when we're offering land acknowledgements, that we arrive in a space knowing exactly who we are, which is part of the reason why Deborah and I felt it was important for you all to know a little bit more about who we are as we stand here in Mi'kma'ki. Next slide. And this is what we're going to be offering you today in our 90 minutes. And we want to make sure that there is lots and lots of time for intervention. And we mean that in all the positive ways. And Deborah's going to talk to you about that a little bit later. But we will have some separate time after the official presentation for a Q&A. But please feel free to flash a hand through the chat. I think Kirli hopefully will be able to monitor that for us. Or if you want to unmic and you feel there's an opportunity to intervene or interject or to share, please feel free to do that. So this is what we're hoping to offer you in our presentation. Next slide. Deborah?
So basically, I've included this slide, community expectations. This is a safe zone. Basically, this is an interactive format, as Rohini mentioned. If you have any questions or comments throughout the presentation, please don't hesitate to ask. And we want this to be a safe environment. So we need to recognize that we all don't have the same perspective or lived experience, but it's important for all voices to be heard. And we need to treat one another with respect. Next slide, please. So I like to start all presentations by providing some sort of a context around equity, diversity, and inclusion and what they mean so that we all have the same understanding. So you can see from this slide here that when we talk about equity, it's not the same as formal equality. Equality equals sameness. Equality equals sameness, whereas equity, on the other hand, equals difference. So if we talk about equality, it means each individual or group of people are provided with the same resources or opportunities. When we talk about equity, it recognizes that each person has different circumstances, and we need to allocate the exact resource or opportunity needed to result in an equal outcome. So you can see from this diagram or illustration here that when the individuals are treated equally, not everyone is able to participate. When we take the individual circumstances into account, we then provide everyone with what they need, and that equals the equitable outcome. So this here is another slide as well that sort of demonstrates the difference between equity and equality. And you can see in the top diagram, the individuals once again are treated equally. Even though they've been treated equally, their individual differences have not been accommodated. When we take an equitable approach, we provide everyone with what they need to possibly come out with a successful outcome. So when we take an equity-based approach, it can sometimes come across as unequal treatment, or often it could be seen as discrimination, but actually taking an equity-based approach is meant to eliminate barriers and level the playing field. And next slide, please. So when we talk about leveling the playing field, if you've ever run a race, you recognize that not everybody is starting at the same place. We have staggered start positions, and that is for a reason. Those on the inner lanes would have an advantage over those who are in the outer lanes. So we have a staggered approach because we want to level that playing field. So equity is a process that acknowledges an even starting place and seeks to correct imbalance, tackling equity issues. It also requires an understanding of the underlying root or causes of outcome disparities. So when we think about equity in the workplace, we can think about it in the context of employment, and that is the employment equity legislation, which is actually law that is in place to level the playing field and remove barriers that exist related to employment. Next slide, please. So we often talk about equity and diversity. So what is diversity? Diversity, as you can see from this diagram, is any dimension that can be used to differentiate groups of people from one another. The concept moves beyond tolerance and encompasses acceptance and respect for these individual differences. You can see from this diversity lens that there are different elements or layers of diversity. We can see age, we see gender, ethnicity, we also see religion, education, moving out to some of the organizational dimensions and then the cultural dimensions. So basically, when we talk about diversity, it's about presence. It's about who's in the space and who is represented. Next slide, please. This is an example of just a different illustration of diversity so that you can see some of the individual dimensions. We all bring a variety of backgrounds with us to our organizations and workplaces. We show up in multiple ways, and today I'm showing up as an African Nova Scotian woman. And think back to the introductory slide that I made and all of the different ways that I introduced myself. Those are all considered dimensions of diversity. And it's important to note that even though they all relate to my identity, I don't just bring one individual perspective. I bring all of those perspectives, all of those dimensions, and they often intersect. So when we talk about diversity, it's also important to recognize that when we talk about diversity, it's not just about what we see. There's also the diversity of thought, there's the diversity of perspective, there's the diversity of lived experience and worldview. Every individual has a different perspective and a different lived experience. It doesn't mean that one is better or worse. It just means they are different. So if we have equity and diversity, equity is more related to the policies and the practices. Diversity is related to the individuals and what they bring in the workplace. We also have inclusion, and inclusion is more related to the culture and the environment. So when we talk about inclusion, it's promoting an environment where you have these individuals from diverse backgrounds. They're in an environment where they feel welcomed and supported, they feel respected and valued, and have access to opportunities so that every individual can reach their full potential. So when we think about the concept of diversity, it's also important to note that diversity is good. That we want diversity in the workplace. We want the value that diversity brings, but it's also important to note that the work environment, the organizational environment, the culture will also contribute to the success of your organization. Now, there is an American consultant who's coined the phrase, diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. That is so relevant because it's not just about bringing individuals in. It's not just about having these diverse perspectives. We need to value what these individuals bring to our organizations. So inclusion is about bringing together and harnessing these diverse voices, their resources in a way that is beneficial to your organization. And it puts the concept and practice of diversity into action. So you could have two people in a room and likely end up with some element of diversity. When it comes to inclusion, that takes effort. We need to be intentional in providing an environment where these individuals do feel a sense of belonging. They do feel that their contributions to the organization or the workplace matter. So in this diagram, you can see the evolution of exclusion to segregation to integration, and the ultimate desirable spot is inclusion. And when it comes to inclusion, it's based on individual perspective. My perspective and my experience is going to differ from Rohini's perspective and her experience in the workplace. So when it comes to inclusion, we need to be intentional in our efforts to provide a climate and a culture where everyone feels a sense of belonging. I personally feel that there is no place that is 100% inclusive. To me, inclusion is an aspiration, and we can't say that we are there because we need to work towards being totally inclusive for everyone. So these are some of the current influences on EDI. We know that the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic, that had impacts on the world of EDI. It uncovered some, I'll say, disparities in the treatment of racialized folks. Other influences on EDI include accessibility. We also have the Black Lives Matter movement, truth and reconciliation, and then we also have members of gender and sexual minorities. Also included in current influences, we could also include the Me Too movement, which also has an impact or an influence on equity, diversity, and inclusion. Next slide, please. Cultural competence. If we're talking about equity, diversity, and inclusion, it's also important for us to be aware of cultural competence and our own competence. And what this is the ability to interact effectively with people from different cultures. So if we're talking about equity and diversity in the workplace, equity and diversity in our organizations, we need to be competent with respect to other cultures. So when we talk about cultural competency, it's the ability, this ability depends on awareness of one's own cultural worldview, knowledge of other cultural practices and worldviews, tolerant attitudes towards cultural difference, and cross-cultural skills. I personally don't like to use the word tolerant because to me there is an element of negativity associated with tolerance. So why is this important from an EDI lens? Cultural competence encourages the acknowledgement and acceptance of differences in appearance, behavior, as well as culture. And if we're going to be an inclusive environment, we need to be aware and work on our own individual cultural competence. It's about self-reflection, looking within, and developing our own ability to interact respectfully, be aware of, and appreciative of other cultures. So what happens if we don't increase our cultural competence? Our opportunity to build those relationships is impossible. So if we're talking about providing an inclusive environment, it needs to be built on the foundation of trust and respect. So instead, we'll coexist with people we don't understand, thereby creating a higher risk for misunderstandings, hurt feelings, and bias, things that can all be avoided. So I talked about cultural competence and what happens if we don't become cultural competent. I'm now going to shift to two impediments to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And the first one is implicit or unconscious bias. So what is implicit or unconscious bias? What do you know about implicit or unconscious bias? We all have biases. These are involuntary or unconscious assumptions and conclusions that each of us have based on limited information. So these biases develop over the course of our lives, and they are formed by social stereotypes about groups of people that we form unconsciously. These biases allow us to filter information and make quick decisions. So these biases are mental shortcuts that aid in decision-making and are learned assumptions, beliefs, or attitudes that exist in our subconscious. So when you think about biases, biases affect every decision that is made in an organization. They affect who gets hired, who gets fired, who gets promoted, who gets disciplined, and how these individual decisions are made are impacted by our own individual biases. Next slide, please. So fact or myth? I know what implicit bias is, and I do not harbor any implicit biases. Next slide, please. This is actually a myth. It's important to note that if you have a brain, you have a bias. It doesn't make us bad people. We need to understand what our biases are in order to put strategies in place to mitigate our biases. So one way of mitigating the impact of our unconscious bias is to actually recognize what our biases are. So there is the implicit association test, which is often referred to as the Harvard unconscious bias test. This is an online tool. You go on the website, you identify the American version or the Canadian version, then you can select which demographic characteristic you would actually like to be tested on to see if you have any biases toward that group. So the implicit association test is based on years of research out of Harvard and seeks to understand hidden biases and their connection to actions. It takes about, I want to say it takes about 15 minutes, and actually it's a time test, and that is because when you are in a hurry to make quick decisions, that's when your biases are likely to kick in. Next slide, please. So when it comes to unconscious bias, the implicit association test is probably the #1 tool that is recognized worldwide. That does have a limitation in that this tool is only good for first-time test takers. Because if you take the test and then you uncover what your biases are, if you redo the test, then you sort of know what they're looking for. So the actual test results, I would say, would be flawed compared to the first time you take the test. Remember, once again, your biases are impacted by your experiences, and it's also related to stereotypes that you have. So strategies for reducing implicit bias include taking the implicit association test. So that Harvard implicit association test will give you an indication of what your biases are. You need to be honest with yourself about the results of the test. And then when it comes to strategies to sort of mitigate your biases, you're encouraged to do stereotype replacement. So what you need to do is you need to reject the stereotypical portrayal or thought and replace it with one that is non-stereotypical. You can seek opportunities as well for greater interaction with members of those groups that you have biases towards. I will now turn it over to Rohini, who will talk about another impediment to equity, diversity, and inclusion, and that is microaggressions.
Thank you, Deborah. Before I get into some of the juicy stuff related to microaggressions, I wanted to offer the opportunity to our participants if there were any inquiries, questions, observations that they wanted to share. They could do that through the chat. Happy to look at the chat, or if you wanted to raise your hand now or unmic, welcome to do that. I am curious about the implicit bias test. I actually haven't taken it. I know, Deborah, I should. And part of it is fear. Part of it is what will be revealed with the brain that I have, what will be found out. And so I do encourage you, and I will practice what I preach and actually do the test at some point. Okay, what are cross-cultural skills? That is a fabulous question. And as somebody from the Faculty of Arts, this is a wonderful question to ask. It is a, this notion of interculturality, if I may, is about the knowing and acknowledgement and not tolerance of one's uniqueness, either themselves and the other person that you're interacting with, and to actually certainly just observe rather than judge. And that's actually a lot harder than we think. I mean, it's really quick to say that person is based on a judgment bias versus an observational bias. So one of the key pieces for intercultural competence or cross-cultural skills is to acknowledge difference. And I'll talk about that a little bit later, but when we hear things like, I don't see color, I don't see the difference between Rohini and Kiralee Freeman. They're absolutely the same. They're both employees in the Faculty of Arts at St. Mary's University. And that would be intercultural incompetence, because what we're doing is we are denying the uniqueness of Kiralee and uniqueness of Rohini. That's my 30-second response to cross-cultural skills, but we will delve into that a little bit later, Gordon, but thank you for that question. Do I see another question? I don't think I do. Okay, I'm going to continue on. Microaggressions are really responses to implicit and implicit bias, which Deborah has outlined for us. And, you know, there are sort of these environmental, biological, and social pieces and elements to it. And so sometimes when we think, well, I have unconscious bias, I can't control what I think. You know, this is what I know. And so that would be part of Gordon's question of the cross-cultural skills. Well, then change what you know. Add to what you know, remain curious. And for those of us who are working here, all of us here are working on the betterment of knowledge and the dissemination of knowledge, either through our academic space or through the museum space. You know, we are innately curious people. All of you are curious for being here on this Tuesday morning. And so use that curiosity to add to your cross-cultural skills. And so microaggressions are really that, as Deborah has mentioned, you know, that sort of quick, automatic, without thinking response. And they're also subtle, which is why they're sometimes difficult to point out. And, you know, I use micro entre guillemets or entre parenthèses, just really, it's sort of an add-on prefix to really an aggression. And I know Deborah and I have, you know, openly shared some of the aggressions that we've experienced on campus, and how that those small, subtle put downs, insults start to wear us down. And so they're often wrapped up in compliments, or what are perceived as compliments by the aggressor. They are often unsettling and very, very frequent. Continue on. Kiralee, thank you. And so we've given you some examples of sexist or gender identity microaggressions. And, you know, I want to be clear here, Deborah and I both want to be clear here, this is not a shaming exercise. We're not here to point fingers. It's really, I feel like it's a lot of this kind of work is very similar to yoga practice. It's really about being with yourself and thinking about yourself here and thinking, what can I do to mitigate some of these conversations I might have had, or even thoughts that I've had in my daily work, in my daily interaction. So we're not here to shame. We're here to bring consciousness and awareness to what we're all experiencing and what we're all doing. And Deborah and I are in the same boat as all of you. And so act like a lady is a term that I cannot use in my house. I have 3 male children, but on top of that, for me, a lady has a Victorian 19th century context to it, and historically would be somebody who is submissive and, you know, walks behind their male spouse, which in my case is never happens. So I would never use the term act like a lady. You are so sensitive for a boy. Again, these are social constructs, social gendered constructs, and sexist constructs that slip through language and are part of conditioning that we're trying to actively unlearn. Gender identity ones, I'll say something like, for those who are non-binary or transitioning, you know, you'll hear or have heard of questions about menstruation and how really, you know, non-binary or those who are transitioning can't have menstruation, or don't have any kind of female body biological conditions. And so these are aggressions. These are, you know, curiosity. Well, I was just wondering, or I was just questioning, or I don't understand, or I'm curious. can still be wrapped up in that curiosity bubble, but really actually ends up being an insult. Next slide, please. Sexuality and religion microaggressions. So we can take a look at these. This often happens laced really heavily with homophobia when it comes to something being gay or that seems gay, and terminology about what gayness might look like. And it is intentionally patriarchal. Religion microaggressions, I think, are very interesting. As of late, with the situation that continues to occur in Iran. We're hearing about hijabi women who are being pointed out and being told to remove their hijab, when in fact it is their right, and the policing of women's bodies simply needs to stop. But the idea of dress codes attached to religion, and because faith and spirituality is so personalized, when one comments on someone's hijab and the assumption that someone who wears a hijab is somehow subdued, submissive, and controlled is problematic and aggressive. Continue on. Thank you. Ability microaggressions. This is one that I'm going to be really open, and I've talked to Deborah about this myself. I am challenged by ableist language. This is a whole other world of unlearning for me. The number of times I hear the term crazy or that's insane is multiple during the day. And I have to stop that from happening. I either engage in it or I don't stop it when I hear it. And it's the kind of terminology that has been conditioned, normalized. That was crazy good, or that sandwich was insane. Really, it's all ableist. It's ableist language. Yesterday, I went to a restaurant where the name happens to have an ableist name in the actual title of the restaurant. And my middle son was like, "Are you going to do something about that, mommy? Are you going to tell the manager?" I'm like, "I need to write a letter about that," and how that's an ableist type of language. So we have to stop and think about the power of language. And when it comes to ableist language, I'm telling you right now that that's still a lot of unlearning for myself. Body image microaggressions are really very interesting as well. I've been reading recently articles on fat phobia, and there's some really interesting seminars that I can pass along. We can pass along to Kira Lee from the CCDI, which is an incredible modules and webinar style learning and unlearning, particularly on fat phobia, and how body image is actually laced, and BMI itself is actually a racist concept, and really throwing away all the medical terminology that many of us have been conditioned to understand, that much of what BMI represents, body mass index, is anti-Black. So really, really interesting research coming out there. And that is what's so exciting about EDIA work, is that it's ongoing. It's a process. It's a continual process of unlearning. So you can't just say, I've done this seminar and I'm good. No, there's so much to learn. So things like commenting on one's body, and the aggressions that are used, and again, sometimes are seen as commonplace or acceptable by in cultural standards. Next slide. So how do you deal with this? There's sometimes there's a lot of teeth grinding that does happen as well, but it can be challenging to handle. And I think as I age, I have a little bit more confidence in speaking up when a microaggression is either happening to me or I'm witnessing it. And so, the notion that we're all emotional and we have feelings, and that power is attached to language, is sometimes an abstract concept for our workplace colleagues. So you really have to decide how much energy I want to put into this. You might ask for clarification. So I don't understand what you mean by that. And I can give you an example. Something like, if I'm ripping into a steak, I might have someone say to me, "But I thought you were Hindu. You don't eat beef, right?" And well, right away, that just tells you the place that I've been given, and the assumptions that are attached to that. And as I chew my beef, I will say, "Well, it looks like I'm not," and then return the question back to them, and I'll say, "Well, I assumed that you were X." but you seem to be eating that salad like there's no stopping you. So really try to take the same question that's been asked of you and return it back. And that often can stop the situation from continuing on. Sometimes you need to reflect and write that letter and take some time to think about the impact that it's had. Or sometimes you pick your battles and you let things go.
Can I jump in just for a moment,
Please.
Rohini, before
Yes.
you move on to the next
Yes.
slide?
Yes.
Like we're talking about responding to microaggressions.
Yes.
As a racialized person, as a Black person, I would say that I've experienced microaggressions on a daily basis.
Yes.
And the types of microaggressions, like Rohini said, they are unintentional, but you get questions like, where are you from?
Yes.
Yeah, where are you from? Can I touch your hair?
Yes.
Oh, you speak good English for a, like, these are the types of
Yes. Aggressions.
yes, that just they wear on you, and they do have an impact on our ability to have that inclusive environment.
That's right.
Sorry.
And no, not at all. No sorries. And actually, Deborah, if I can add on to that, when many of us who carry racialized identities, when we want to respond back, we are seen as, and then there's a whole list of descriptors, particularly Black females are seen as angry, intolerant, can't take a joke, can't take a compliment. And particularly for myself as somebody of South Asian descent, I will get things like, well, you're not used to people complimenting you. You're not used to that because, you're not white. And this has happened. This happens a lot. And I will say that after a while, you can let things go because you don't want to expend any energy trying to manage. We'll continue on. So here we go. Here's some tactics. Responding straight away, address it there and then. This is what I'm working on. This is my goal. That's where I want to be, where I don't have a tightness in my chest or in my throat. I'm not worried what people think about me. I think that comes with age and experience. Responding later can be a little bit of like an angry email, an emotionally driven letter. But then I'm like, I'm wasting paper and time. But sometimes you really want to respond in a more intense way. I remember being at the airport and there was a sign that says French English. So, they usually say, hello, bonjour. And I go, bonjour. And then the person said, I said, oh, ça va? And he goes, oh, as if you would speak French. And I thought, oh, isn't that interesting? So you're assuming that I don't speak French. And of course, part of me wants to like whip out the PhD. And then I thought, okay, well, I'm just going to continue to speak in French because you say that you do. And then he said, I actually don't speak French. So then, I'm a little verklempt and I'm a bit sweaty and I'm not very happy. And I had to go through security, which is always, random padding that I usually get down to. And so I wanted to get through the security and then deal with my emotions when I found his manager and they told me to go to a website, which I didn't go and look at. Next slide, please. So this is, at the heart and soul of what, I know, particularly in the academic space, but for all of you working in museum space, why we are engaging this conversation. I think it's important that we understand what decolonization means. And it is this notion of mentality attached to movement is how I see it. So this notion that we are rewriting narratives and knowing that the narratives were written by those who are either the oppressor or a dominant culture. And this ongoing colonial state that many of us remain in. And for those of us, for example, myself, whose parents were in colonial spaces when they migrated to Mi'kma'ki, that colonial mindset still remains. And so those mentalities of being not yourself. There's an active decolonization process that's very individualized, which helps, I hope, the overall arching of academic or museum space. So we want the individual mindset to change so that we can permeate that through institutions, through systems, So it's not that the system has to change. Actually, we are the system. And so we also have to do the work so that can permeate into systems. And that means work, that means changes, that means shifting, that means staying curious, that means unlearning. So, I mean, I am really quick to say, oh, the institution needs to do things, but I keep forgetting that I have to have that mindset so that I can live, exemplify, and be a decolonizer in my management space that I'm in. Rebuilding culture must interrogate. Oh, sorry, Carolee, go back there for a second. Thank you. Paul Fanon, who was one of my literary crushes, if I can say, and I studied him quite a bit in my PhD in post-colonial literature. But he talked about rebuilding culture that interrogates colonialism's turmoil on the inner world and psyche. I think this is important. This goes back to unconscious bias, right? It goes back to, well, I was born with, racist grandparents who were around me. Okay, that's okay. We can still unlearn that. And so interrogating how colonialism has affected all of us, and not just those who were oppressed, but the oppressors as well. Those whose ancestry is attached to colonial spaces need to also do the work. Okay, continue on. Thank you. It is a process. I think a lot of the time we think, okay, so now I've decolonized. No, I mean, some of the acts that we do and the approaches that we have and the way that we engage in language, the way that we continue our cross-cultural skills, going back to Gordon's question, that is a process and not a product. And so we can't think of a finish line. You have been here, you're taking your time this morning to be with us. This is one step in the journey, and then we have to decide where that goes. And you have to ask yourself, what are your reasons? Why are you here? Not just because the boss asked you to be here, but not because Carolee has made it in an interesting an advert for you to sign up. But why are you thinking about decolonization? And for whom? Is it for the patrons that come to your museum? Is it for the new and upcoming archivists who you want to hire who will be racialized or of color? So really, what is your why? And that's important, because otherwise we can recolonize. We can end up in a tokenism space where we just kind of pull somebody into the space and then say, well, we've done our job. We've had a Black archivist now, and so now we're good. We have to think about what the reason is. And that actually is really challenging, because it literally is opening up a can of worms. And it sometimes means that we have to really pull back and open up dialogue that can be difficult. Next slide. So this is a little bit of a personal sharing that I wanted to share with you all about how I'm decolonizing and healing as a racialized woman in academia. And I hope that this works, helps you kind of in the museum space as well. But I see it sort of, a ladder, and this trestle that's there, that is my, lived experience and my institutional knowledge, because I have the accreditation, but I also have lived experience, and that is important. And that makes that ladder of success actually more stable, which really is me. So I'm not climbing some other ladder. I am the ladder, and I have to be more stable. And so what does that mean? Well, the university is unpredictable. The institution, there are lots of opportunities for aggression. And despite all of us, most of us fairly educated, there's going to be opportunity for unconscious bias to grow, and intolerance and stereotype to continue to fester. So what I'm doing is I'm investing in stabilizing my ladder by securing myself, by continually to actively unlearn, to out myself. I should do this implicit bias test to know that I really need to learn more about ableist language. And that really shifts my mindset and matches the mandate that I'm asked to do, that I get to do in my institution. Am I being inclusive with, last question, sorry, Carolee, there's one more question on that last slide. Am I being inclusive with myself? Am I creating a healthy learning environment with myself? Am I learning with kindness, empathy, compassion with myself? And I know that sounds very egocentric, and actually seems uncomfortable for me, somebody who's been conditioned under the patriarchy to not think about myself. But actually that's empowering, because the more and more I do that, that is actually how I continue to decolonize the space. Okay, next slide. So acknowledging colonial conditioning, this is really important. My parents were born under colonial rule, as India and Pakistan were partitioning under British occupation, and my grandparents suffered under famines and discrimination, particularly on my mother's side, who's Indigenous. There's a deeply embedded mindset that I have to acknowledge. I have this corrosive belittling of the other, which is Deborah insinuated with microaggressions, that small, those continuous insults, moving around away from what is the normal norm, which is often cis, hetero, white, male, able-bodied. That is sort of the center, and everybody else is around that. And so I'm trying to move away from that as being the center. That if I have this title of diversity excellence, well, actually my diversity is my excellence, and I'm showing up as me in all of those angles, as Deborah had told us, right? When we show up in our identity, there are so many levels of that, and that's how I decolonize. I try to wear a sari every week. And I have my hashtag, sorry, not sorry. And that is part of my decolonization practice, right? This is normalization. This is not a costume. There's no, visitor from India. I'm just doing my thing, and I'm going to go to Starbucks with my sari on. So that is a active unlearning of, discomfort, I think, for my own mindset. And what's implicit in colonialism, we know, is patriarchy, racism, and excessive individualism. And that's where sometimes I have to balance that out and say, it's not just me, myself, and I, but it's more all of the versions of me and in the inclusivity of me that allows myself to decolonize so I can help the university. Next slide, please. So is decolonization even possible, especially if the same tools and systems of colonization are employed in attempts to decolonize? This is hard. I mean, I'm using the same system, but I'm trying to break from that system. And that can get a little bit tiring. That can be a little bit overwhelming. And you want to kind of give up after a while. And that is where, that prioritizing of one's, as Frantz Fanon talked about, the psyche and the mindset. Next slide, please. Okay, Deborah, that's you.
So basically, who has a seat at the table? We must deconstruct and reconstruct using transformative tools created by Indigenous, grassroots, and majority world communities. Tables built for them, nothing about them without them. And this is important. If we're talking about decolonization, we need to involve the voices of Indigenous peoples. Going back to the point regarding biases, it's about unlearning and relearning. And the reason we included the implicit association test in this presentation is because if you have a hidden bias, or if you have stereotypical beliefs about Indigenous peoples, how can you then decolonize oneself? It's important that you recognize if there is a bias there and put measures in place to mitigate those biases. Next slide, please. So in closing, it's about getting comfortable with multiformity and fluidity. Decolonization has multiple definitions, and that's okay. It is a colonial construct that everything has to be rigid or rigidly defined, and the fluidity of decoloniality allows for a multifaceted approach to decolonization so that various aspects of the colonial mountain can be attacked simultaneously. Next slide, please. So inclusion, bringing this all back to inclusion, the inclusion of Indigenous voices is a necessity at the decision-making table. Their perspectives, lived experiences, expertise, and knowledge systems come first and must inform all other work. They must inform language, frameworks, and strategies. So back to you, Rohini.
That's back to me. So a lot of the time, when I was in this, when I first came into this role, a lot of the work that I've been doing on EDIA has been on the side of my desk. I was always sort of doing it in some way. This notion of where it sits in your organization is important to know that it has to be centralized. So what does that mean? So I think of, I'll use the institution of university institution. St. Mary's itself I'm in the beautiful 923 Roby Street, the beautiful gray building. And it has a lovely brick and I have a lovely view. And that's the facade that we see on the outside. And let's say, we enter and not everything is very accessible. And, we could even use the analogy of a Victorian home in Halifax or in beautiful Yarmouth, where there are these beautiful Victorian homes where the hallways are a little narrow and the windows are not very efficient, but it's very pretty on the outside. And then if the EDIA office is sort of at the back and it's an extension, it's at the back of the house, it's been added on, or sometimes it's actually just a shed. And if you want to talk to Deborah and Rohini, you have to kind of still go through an uncomfortable space, very pretty, but not very efficient to get to EDIA. What I think of it is as let's bring it into centralized heating. Let's make it the core of the home. Let's make it like as if we have efficient heat going throughout the house, and you still want to keep that beautiful Victorian facade, and I understand that, but perhaps have a little bit more open concept. That means you might have to take down a wall. That means you might have to go down to the studs and do some repairs on the roof, right? And that costs money, that requires people, and that requires strategy, and it requires a commitment. And probably taking the implicit bias test, which I still have to do. So that's really what EDIA is. It's really about taking it away from the back and bringing it into the center and really having that conversation and say, okay, now we've centralized it. Whew, that means I really have to take down this rotting wood. This means I really have to make those stairs a little bit wider, or maybe I have to get rid of the stairs and actually have a ramp. And so, we can do infrastructure changes physically, but when we have to think about bringing actual knowledge and knowledge dissemination and approaches to knowledge dissemination and museum ways of knowing, that might have been always the way we've done it, and we're going to have to do it a little bit differently, we might actually have to change the structure of the home. And that requires a big commitment. So that's kind of how I see it. I think inclusion is very possible. It is utopic at times. Not everyone's going to be happy. There will have to be some adjustments. And, we know this when we hold the door for somebody who's perhaps using a device of some sort to walk up the stairs, you're going to have to hold the door a little bit longer until that person has the opportunity to completely come in and, use their device to come into the main frame of the house. We're not going to slam the door on their face. And it means that we have to take a little bit of extra time of our day to allow someone else into that space. Next slide, please. Okay, that's the faceless human who really needs some eyes. Next time, Deborah, we got to have somebody with eyes and a nose. This is an opportunity, and we're at 11:30 to talk to us. Thank you.
Thank you both so much for that. That was wonderful. Shall I stop sharing and then just maybe open it up so that we can see everybody?
Yeah, that sounds okay. Yeah,
right.
Of course. Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah, so we're at 11:30 and Deborah and I are here for clarifications or any other further discussions, anything about, sort of the microaggression piece or other ways of decolonizing. We're here to share, or anybody else like to share or talk. Okay, we got a thank you. That was excellent. Okay, thank you, Nadine. Deborah, do you have anything else on cross-cultural skills? Back to Gordon's question.
The only thing I would add with respect to cross-cultural skills, you know, we talk a lot about, like, you know, diversity in the workplace, diversity and the value that it brings. Along with diversity, there can also be challenges. And I think it's important to talk about those challenges. And one of those challenges is around cross-cultural communication. And if we're talking about cultural competence, I think we do need to examine how we communicate with one another, because there is a way to do that respectfully and with competence and awareness of other cultures. That is important, because that's providing us, it provides everyone with that knowledge and awareness. So, you know, we talk about learning and relearning, unlearning and relearning. It's continuous. We all need to continue to learn. And there, with learning, I believe, comes an appreciation of other cultures. And with that appreciation, there is more of an appetite to be more of an inclusive and welcoming environment.
I think what resonated for me in what you said, Rohini, is that it's about acknowledging difference and not judging.
That's right.
So it's not like, oh, the French,
Yes.
they do it a weird way.
That's right. That's right.
Oh,
That's right.
that's how they do it there. Huh.
That's how they
It's
do it
different
there.
from how we do it
That's
here.
right.
Huh.
That's right. And it's different. And
Yeah.
and that part of not judging is so hard. I'm just noticing Gordon's comments here. The first explanation was unclear. That's right. You have to take one of my courses, and then you can lots of clarity. But the difficulty of seeing things from another's eyes. Thank you, Gordon, for that. And that is challenging, because you're not expected. I'm not supposed to know what it's like to be a Black woman. I'm not a Black woman. I don't know. I appreciate and I have empathy and I have compassion for my Black female friends. And I learn, and I read, and I understand, and I question my own biases and my own stereotypes and my own issues with shadeism and colorism. And then I go, oh yeah, you've got stuff to learn, Rohini. You've got to really get to know history a bit better. You've got to really understand. And so that's really what it means to be in someone else's eyes. And I think intercultural competence is acknowledging without judgment, staying curious, and celebrating difference. I mean, many of us, I was actually just with some students this morning. I run a French immersion cafe where I try to get students to practice French. And I talk about openly about the fact that for so long, I tried to make my accent perfect in French. What does that perfect mean? Who's perfect? And that accents are actually glorious, because accents show that we speak multiple languages and we have multiple approaches, and we're still attempting to speak a language that's not our own. And that we can share that experience with others. And so I had two students who were Hispanophones, one from Colombia and one from Spain. And they were both speaking Spanish with accents that were particular to them. And that was a celebration of accents versus, you don't sound like standardized French, which is a decolonization process right there in that space. We are decolonizing. And so trying to understand from another person's eyes is challenging, because we're not that person. So we try to get as close as we can. I see some hands. I'm just going to read Judy's and then Lynn's, and then I'm going to go to Maggie. Judy says, very thought-provoking, gives much to think about. It certainly is an area that we need to learn more about and act accordingly to become an inclusive environment. We have good intentions, but we have to act more intentionally. Thank you. The intentions are a big piece. Lynn, is you mentioned once you know you have biases, you should put measures in place, for example, when working on decolonization or a project, yes, to help mitigate those biases. Other than involving people from that community, can you suggest some other types of measures to mitigate biases? Great question. I'll answer that with an answer, and then Debbie can, and then I'm going to go to Maggie. I think for me, and this is just the nerdy part of me, which is really reading, listening to podcasts, talking to people without sort of saying, so Debbie, explain to me what Blackness is. That's not Debbie's job to explain what her Black experience is in Nova Scotia. ideally, I would have come to the table with some information and remain curious in a way that's respectful. And often I think that we have good intentions. We just don't know how to particularly ask the question. And that can be perceived as an insult. I think the other thing is to really have a lot of knowledge that you carry with you, which is that intercultural competence piece, by reading and listening and understanding through reading or podcasts is what I do. Debbie, and then I'm going to go to Maggie's question.
Yeah, I would agree with you, Rohini. When we talk about implicit biases, these develop over time. So we need to put strategies in place to be able to counter those biases that can come through the involvement or associating yourself with. If I have a bias towards members of the 2S LGBTQ community, then I need to put measures in place where I'm going to counter those biases. I'm going to involve myself in a situation or an opportunity to re-educate myself and relearn to counter those biases. That can come through more awareness and exposure.
Yes.
And that's important. And I'm not saying I'm going to go out and look for a member of the 2S LGBTQ community and say, hey, I want to be best friends.
Right.
Because that's not genuine. To me, it's about putting measures in place, authentic measures in place that will help to relearn what I've learned, to reestablish what has developed over time.
I'm going to go to Maggie, but I thought about this yesterday. I was with one of my healthcare providers, and I was telling him how when I go to the gym, I always avoid the rower. And I'm like, and this is my massage therapist, and he's like, why do you avoid the rower? And I'm like, I don't like it. I feel very exposed, and like my front side of my body's all squished, and I have to like sit and people can see me, and I'm like gasping for air. And he's like, but that's why you got to do it. He's like, that's why. Don't go on the Stairmaster and zone out. He's like, get on that machine, because that makes you a little bit uncomfortable, and you're using your body a little bit differently, and you're rewiring your brain. So that's really how I see that as well. Like, if I'm uncomfortable with a drag performer, maybe I need to like expose myself a little bit more and figure out how to mitigate those fears. Maggie, I see your hand, please.
Can I also add one more thing? Sorry,
Yes.
as we're talking about biases, I think it's important for you as an individual to be honest with yourself and ask yourself,
yes,
why do I feel this way?
Yes.
Why have I developed a bias towards a particular group? Did something happen that allowed you or enabled you to have this sort of perspective, or create this stereotypical narrative about a group of people?
Mhm.
Is it based on the media, right? Is it based on the media's portrayal of a certain group of people?
Right.
Why do you have this sort of hidden bias towards this group? And I think that's important, that we need to be honest with ourselves when we get the result of the implicit association test.
Maggie.
Thank you guys so much. Most of you actually in the group will know me, but I'm going to introduce myself quickly. I'm the executive director for the Association of Nova Scotia Museums. So we're really pleased to actually be hosting you guys today. I have written down a bunch of notes that I want to follow up with everybody about. What I really loved about your guys' presentation is you talked about the individual things that we can do, how we have to take individual responsibility and change how we are thinking. I want to ask a question, but it's that type of question you always hate being asked of. I just want you to kind of make a comment on something. Mm-hmm. One of the things you talked about was rewriting narratives, knowing that narratives were written by the oppressor. Mm-hmm. In museums, we are really struggling with that. I was in a presentation a while back about EDI, and it talked about the 3 pillars of colonization being the education system, the justice system, and museums. And the education system is a fairly well-resourced system. The justice system is a fairly well-resourced system. Museums do have well-resourced museums, but a lot of the ones, especially the ones gathered here today, might have 1 or no staff. That one or no staff might be working for minimum wage. And so we are dealing with really tiny, tiny resources. And these people are coming in and they're working on passion. And so this act of rewriting narratives is a really challenging thing. So I wanted to give you guys an opportunity to speak about that, because it's something that when we leave EDI training, it's something I know the museum always community talks about, going, we want to do it, but we're one person and we have to keep the doors open and we have to keep the power bill paid. So that's why I loved what you guys talked about, that individual piece, but I want to let you expand on that a little bit there.
Okay, I will throw in a quick comment. Thank you, Maggie. I got to see you in action at the Mi'kmaq Friendship Center, where I creeped my way in as a non-museum person because of Kira, so I got to hear you speak there. The rewriting of the narrative by one person is still impactful, because we as individuals, I mean, it's sort of that concept of like, did you vote? Did you vote? Did you vote? Did you vote? Yeah, each individual vote counts. But money is important and budgets are important, and budget means that that's how things actually move forward on the process. You know, and when you're speaking about justice, I was just listening to CBC this morning about how Halifax police budget, there's been a lot of pushback to not give the police more money. And that money should be going to, and this was very exciting to hear, libraries, yeah, maybe museums, right? And so why are libraries and, you know, what maybe libraries and museums need to be put in that same centralized space of knowledge. And so money is a huge one. And that means that the system has to decide that museums need to decolonize. And that is a step-by-step, person-by-person effort. And all of you here are working hard to do that. And you want to do it, but you don't have the people power for it. I'm going to sound very utopic and say, but even one, you know, for the sake of one person, you can make a change. And I think we have to hold on to that idea, because if you know, if Maggie as association director can continue to advocate for EDI all the time as centralized heating versus the shed, we need money in the center. We need money in the center. And then that is dispersed out to rural parts of Nova Scotia in particular. Then perhaps some change of money shifting can happen. This is very utopic to think, but it does come down to money. I will say that even in higher ed, you know, do what you can while you can in diversity, but it's still not centralized in the same way, right? And it's still me having to convince larger systems that what I'm asking is important. So thank you for bringing up a reality, and I don't have a solution.
That's okay. I just wanted to have your comments on there because I know it's the conversation everyone goes and has after. So thank you.
No
I
problem.
would also add to that response, community and the value that community brings. So when and where possible, I would also suggest working with the community and the community voice as an advocate on your behalf.
Okay. All right, I'm going to go to Ruth, and then I'm going to go to a couple of questions in the chat, and then to Kelly. Ruth.
Hi.
Hi.
Okay. I wanted to make a comment on a couple of things. One was right at the very beginning when you mentioned about the casual nature of microaggressions, etc. Something I noticed as a little kid. I was very lucky. I grew up in a home where, in particular, my father was very much a person that you treated all people as people. Like there were no, it was important to do that, to welcome all people and treat all people as people. So when I went out then to school and whatnot, and I would see some of the things that people said to others, so the verbal microaggressions, when they weren't exactly micro. So when there was a nastiness in the aggression, the verbal aggressions, it was so clear what that was. I mean, everybody could tell what it was, but in a way, it was easier to get other people on side to stop it.
Yes.
What bothered me the most was actually the casualness
Yes.
of the less obvious aggressions. And those are really hard to get anybody on side.
Yeah.
It was just a case then of demonstrating that, for example, that I didn't see that person in such a way, but the intent was there. And I remember as a little kid talking to my dad about that, like, why do people say this? Or even the first time I heard somebody called ugly, I was quite little, and it was my brother referred to somebody as ugly, and I went to my dad and said, "What does ugly mean?" Because it wasn't a term I had ever heard used. And he was quite smart enough to say, where did you hear this word?
Mhm.
So I told him. And he said, "Oh, that makes sense." My brother was 4 years older, so well, that makes sense. So we talked about ugliness is really in the person who's doing the name calling. They're seeing the ugliness in someone else that's not really ugliness. It's maybe the shape of the person's face or something like that, which also reflects the person's experience and good things. But it was the casualness of that.
Yeah.
And then one other quick thing that when I was a little kid, I had the benefit of not only having my both parents, but also Dad's mother lived with us. And I loved talking to older people. So I got a chance to see what these experiences were that my grandmother had lived, my mother and father, and that I lived. So I could see this progression.
Yes.
Not all of it necessarily good in society, but there was a progression.
Yes.
And then as I got older and started to understand what this whole business of colonialism, that, that there was this term,
Yep.
and to see that, and in ways that people don't necessarily see. And I saw that in many, many ways.
Yes.
And that's become increasingly important to me to try to look at ways to kind of undo it or roll it back or change.
Yep.
But part of that I found was to look at the reasons behind the colonialization.
Yes.
So that's really what made, if people weren't being greedy, wanting to control, wanting to belittle others, those things, there would have been no need for people to feel like they had to colonize and subjugate other people. And even, I guess, one more small thing, when I was at the University of Winnipeg, I was doing research and into some of the older forms of psychological theories, etc. And I was really horrified to find an actual reference in something that had been taught to people as psychology, which listed the so-called reasons why Black people were inferior, like the smaller brain size and all of these things. And I was sitting there with my mouth open in this little corner of the library saying, my God, who could say something like this? But yet if you taught people that, it's no wonder, that stuff was just to basically to justify the belief system of somebody who basically also wanted to even academically colonize other people, or whatever, that it was in so many places. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Ruth, for all of that. If I can, first of all, we're all fabulous. Nobody's ugly. I think that's great. I thank you for using that example, because it's the power of the word, right? You'd never heard that word before. And so, something in you told you that there was something off about the word. But yeah, everybody here, I think that we've all resonated with someone making some sort of comment of our physical appearance somewhere along our journey. So thank you for bringing that up. And also the intergenerational cycle, breaking that cycle. We often talk about intergenerational trauma within racialized populations and saying Indigenous populations where we think we feel that it resonates only with those peoples, but it happens with all groups of people
Yes.
where there's a continuance of a certain mindset and ways of belief, and you're actively trying to stop that. So thank you for your
Yes.
comments. I want to go to the comments in the chat, and then I will get to Kelly, and I think Kelly's also in the chat too, so that works out well. Michelle talked a little bit about microaggressions in her comments and the difference between interest to insults. That's a really, really good piece. I'm just interested. I just wanted to know, like, what do Hindus do? Well, why would you be asking me? Well, you're a Hindu, aren't you? Well, no, but you look like one. Well, there are many people, ethnic groups in India, and actually there is not one Indian population. So I can certainly give you my books, and here's a book that you can read about it, but I actually don't have as much information as you might appear to think that I have. Well, I mean, I'm not insulting you, I'm giving you a compliment. So that's sort of that twist of how comments and lack of cross-cultural skills can penetrate and permeate through a conversation. And so your reference to being a redhead, I can, having spent some time in Ireland, I understand perhaps that context. Kelly, did you want to speak on your comment in the chat or anything else?
No, I will. First of all, I want to go back to Maggie's comment, and she's dead on. I mean, it's a big job.
Yes.
It's something that has so much impact, and we have such a small amount of resources,
Yes,
like to deal with that. And I'm from the Black Loyalist Heritage Society here in Shelburne, and a hail out to my peeps who are sitting in the audience. We're a very, very small group, and we do a lot of phenomenal work. But we're tiny. So, we're dealing with this kind of thing. We want to make sure we're saying the right things to our folks when they walk in the door, our visitors, and making sure everything is done right. So, it's it is so important. And I guess the note that I put in my comments is that we are moving in the right direction, and colonialism seems to be the big word of the day, but it's kind of getting everybody's heads wrapped around that, including those who are the colonialists.
sure.
That there is a problem, and the problem is that it dates back so far.
Mm-hmm.
And then my other point, and I don't normally put a point out with offering a solution, but this is a big one.
Yes.
I always feel resentful that it's
Sure.
those of us who are different
Yes.
are always put on the spot to be
Yes.
the ones that are educating, and it becomes exhausting after a while. It's good, as Ruth says, it's those that are the most passionate about doing it, but at the end of the day, we're tired.
Yes, we are.
We kind of want somebody to pick up, somebody
Yeah.
that has the bigger mantle, and somebody that
Right.
has the
Right.
power to say, come on, let's do something about this.
I'll acknowledge both your points. Thank you for the work that you're doing, and thank you for being so, careful with that narrative and making sure that when people enter your space, that the narrative is in alignment with experience and history. Kirli is a historian. We know history matters, it's important, and it's what brings us to the present day, with the hopes of changing the future by understanding the history. So thank you for that piece and acknowledging the fact that you're a small group. And with the second point, colonialism, is not a new word. It has been going on. Many of us carry it. Those who are Indigenous to Turtle Island have been living it. And so it's not new in that way. It's being spoken of by the descendants of settlers. And that is an uncomfortable space to be in. And it's like, well, that happened a long time ago. Why are we talking about that now? Well, because the intergenerational effects, exactly what Ruth talked about, continue. And so the burden that has been placed on those who were most affected by colonized space or colonized nations, that burden is on us. However, we've been silenced for a long time. And so to have the opportunity to speak up seems very urgent as well. Oh, we got to do something about this. We got to talk. We got to do it. We got to do it. But it is exhausting. And that's where it comes back to that psyche and being careful with yourself and the mindset of oneself. And I will tell you, Deborah and I are going to have a long lunch after this, because there's an emotional labor that's attached to this work. when I talk about microaggressions and I share with all of you, and Deborah shares our own experiences, it brings us back to that space. And I'm not going to be able to walk out the door and act like everything's okay, because it's not. We're being vulnerable and we're being cautious with our own battery level. And so we will have to take some time and you know, give ourselves some space. So it is a burden, and I try my very best, because I'm innately a teacher. I try to think of it as, if you're going to ask me a question, be prepared for a lecture. But if I'm going to give you a lecture, I'm going to have to take a nap. And there's a really, really great book that the Black student advisor here at St. Mary's gifted me. It's called Rest is Resistance. Rest is Resistance. I'm going to put that into the chat. And it's a manifesto. So I'm like, okay, if it says manifesto, that means I have to do it. And that is a way that I resist sometimes the overburden that I feel as a racialized person. I'll stop there. Deborah?
First of all, thank you, Kelly, for the comment. When it comes to doing this type of work, like you're talking about educating others about biases, it doesn't matter if it's like work around biases, anti-racism, and there seems to be an equity tax that's associated with this type of work.
Yes.
And if you are in an organization or an institution where there are very few individuals who look a certain way, everything falls on these individuals to do that educating. And that is why I think it's important for us to have, and I hate using the term allies because I think it's overused, but we need individuals who are going to help with this burden, help lift it off of our shoulders, because it's not ours to bear. Everybody has the responsibility here to do this sort of work. So I appreciate your comment with respect to this falling on certain individuals. And then I see Gordon's comment as well with respect to countering the misinformation posted on social media is impossible. I agree 100%. It doesn't end. It doesn't end. And I don't know if you want to call it job security, but we've talked about this being a journey. And in my personal opinion, there is no end point. This is continuous. This work is continuous.
Thank you for all your comments. Anything else? I did put the name of the book into the chat. And I'll put my email in there too, if you're interested in writing to me. If you Google Rohini Bannerjee, there's a Bollywood actress. That's not me. She's wearing a white cat suit and does not look like this. That's not me. So don't send her an email, but you can send me. I have double N, double E in my name.
I also have a question before we end. Do you have any sort of EDIA committee and advisory council or anything in place within the museums? A joint committee, a single committee in a particular area?
I'm going to speak out on behalf of museums. This is Maggie, for anyone who doesn't have their camera going. Different museums have EDI committees. So okay. I know, for example, the Nova Scotia Museum has one for their 28 museums. The association of our group does not currently have one, but we've been working with our TRACK program, which is our training and resources program, and trying to turn it into a lot more of an EDI focused. Also as a result of the Unlocking Project, which is how you guys kind of came to the Mi'kmaq Friendship Center this fall. That was a result of 9 sessions we did around the province. We're pretty sure that EDIA committee for that group is going to be coming out. So that one will be working with community museums. So there's no current one answer. And I think because everyone's so disjointed, but there are lots of little pieces being done in this work.
Perfect. Okay.
I think we used our time very wisely, Kiralee.
I think we did too.
So impressed with our timing.
Me too. I'm so impressed
Very
with
good.
everything. This was wonderful. So I know everyone joins me in thanking you both, Deborah and Rohini, for the presentation, for your candor and your sincerity and your wonderful intent, and for sharing all of this with us today. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. And I'm going to do a shameless plug as well on behalf of Rohini and I, that we do a separate presentation on implicit or unconscious bias. So if you're ever interested in having that presentation for your group, please feel free to reach out.
Thank you so much, both. Thanks to everyone for attending. And I hope you have an excellent long lunch.
Thank you.
Yes, we'll see you
Thank
soon.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Everybody.
Bye.
Au revoir. Au revoir, merci.